Official driving the global women's agenda has called on countries to ensure that laws enacted to protect women and girls are enforceable with strict consequences. The Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, was speaking exclusively with our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease ahead of the International Women's Day on March the 8th. That marks the beginning of the 59th session of the Commission of the Status of Women in New York. Women's ministries from member states, right groups and NGOs will descend on the Big Apple to review 20 years since the Beijing Declaration and the Platform of Action, and what gaps need to be filled to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment by 2030.
The Executive Director, as she's known here, wants to talk about the positives on an issue where it's difficult to ignore the negatives.
We have to step it up because the 20 years of implementing the Beijing Platform and the Millennium Development Goals has proven to us that when nations work together on specific critical goals, they can make changes. And we saw a lot of work that has brought girls and boys into school, with many countries that started at a very low level having reached now parity in schools, even though not all countries achieved that.
She quickly mentions that the quality everywhere is not good, dropout rates too high, and that broadly speaking, progress on women and girls' rights has been patchy at best. 1 in 3 women across the globe still face forms of sexual and physical violence, something she hopes will be drastically reduced as part of the Sustainable Development Goals.
In Goal 5, which is the goal that is focusing on women, it has enhanced leadership between men and women, and it aims to reach and push for gender equality. It has unpaid care work, reducing unpaid care work, because the majority of women do unpaid care work, reducing it, recognizing it and redistributing it. And also harmful practices like female genital mutilation and early and forced child marriages. That also is an area that has to be addressed significantly by 2030. In fact, early and child, that should be over by 2030.
The Watershed 1995 Beijing conference is often remembered for these words by this then First Lady of the United States.
If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
20 years on, do you think we've moved on from that statement, or is that statement as relevant today as it was 20 years ago?
A lot of countries made progress, access to contraception, and we saw some countries where contraception was made available, that the population was managed in a much better way. But that has not been a right. The fact that you could have access from a development perspective to reproductive health services and still have forced marriages, and the child and the girls do not have a right to refuse being married off when they are young. You know, those contradictions have robbed us of certain far-reaching benefits that we could have made.
I mean, so countries shouldn't have schizophrenic policies.
And we also need to ensure that we continue to build not just the women's movement, which we need to build, but we also need to bring in the men as participants.
How do we repoliticize women's rights and the question of violence against women?
We need to make sure that leaders who are elected, leaders who depend on the votes of women, serve this electorate called the women. But also women need to stand up to the leaders and demand a service from the people that they elect.
Scandinavian countries were leading on gender equality globally, while Rwanda had made the most strides in Africa.
In Africa, Rwanda has done much better than anybody else, both in representation, but also in a number of supportive mechanisms that address gender equality.
She called for a culture of consequence and zero tolerance to support women and girls.
Countries will come here next week to CSW, present their country reports. What do you want to hear in particular?
Business as usual. That when it comes to the changes that we are talking about, I need to see that these changes are enforceable.
In a world where far too many situations result from poor decisions in which women and girls suffer the most. And as Hillary Rodham Clinton famously said 20 years ago,
as long as discrimination and inequities remain so commonplace everywhere in the world, as long as girls and women are valued less, fed last, overworked, underpaid, not schooled, subjected to violence in and outside their homes, the potential of the human family to create a peaceful, prosperous world will not be realized.
Words that sadly still ring true in many parts of the world today. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.